Might go up just a hair. Well, good afternoon. That was the mic check. I guess it's working. Hi. How's everybody today? I'm Dave Ferguson, Dean of the College. Happy to welcome you here to the launch of our spring guest lecture series. So, there you go. Yeah. So thanks for helping us kick this off with a very special Sappenfield lecture. So Charlie Sappenfield served as founding dean of this college from 1965 to 1981. And he was, if you think about forming a college of architecture and planning from scratch, what are the pieces you need? And he was a strong believer in building a diverse range of speakers into the college to help expose people who at that time were all coming from Indiana. Now we have students from all over, but back then it was a bunch of Hoosiers just showing up, and it's like, what's the rest of the world look like in this design frame? And so we had a number of fantastic speakers in those early years that Charlie was able to bring in, and that actually became the genesis for our Monday lecture series, which continues to this day, 55 or 60 years later. So upon Charlie's retirement, a fund was established, and was meant to elevate certain lecturers by bringing particularly impactful leaders to campus to be designated as Sappenfield lecturers. Also this semester, we have 6 additional lectures scheduled. We hope you can join us for each one. You can always email to caplectures@bsu.edu if you have questions about the schedule, or if you don't see it on the screens around the building. And most of our lectures are also posted on our YouTube channel, the CAP YouTube channel. So if you happen to miss one, you are usually going to have an option to watch it later. Faculty and alums, we have both AIA and LACES continuing education credits today. Both were very easy to get, as today's lecturer, Susannah Drake, is uniquely accomplished in both fields, as you will soon learn. So now I'd like to introduce Taylor Metz, Assistant Teaching Professor of Landscape Architecture, who will tell you more about today's guest speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great anticipation and honor that we welcome Susannah Drake, Fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and Fellow American Institute of Architects, as our distinguished Sappenfield Guest Lecturer today. Susannah is a luminary in the fields of architecture and landscape architecture, known for her pioneering work in urban ecological infrastructure and large-scale planning projects. As a principal at Sasaki and founder of DLANDstudio Architecture and Landscape Architecture, Susannah brings a wealth of experience and expertise to her interdisciplinary approach. Throughout her career, Susannah has garnered numerous accolades, including the AIA Young Architects Award, fellowship in both AIA and ASLA, one of 4 people that currently have both of those those fellowships, which is really wonderful. As well as recognition as an Architectural League emerging voice. Susannah's dedication to advancing resilient urban infrastructure is evident in her extensive portfolio, which includes projects funded by renowned organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the New York State Council on the Arts. Her commitment to education is equally impressive, having taught at esteemed institutions such as Harvard Graduate School of Design and the University of Colorado Boulder. Beyond her professional endeavors, Susannah is deeply involved in various boards and associations. Her multifaceted background, from her BA at Dartmouth College and her Master's of Architecture and Master's of Landscape Architecture degrees from Harvard University, all of this underscores her comprehensive understanding of the built environment. We're in for a treat, everybody. We're privileged to have Susannah Drake share her insights and her expertise with us here today, and we eagerly anticipate her enlightening lecture on resilient urban infrastructure and the intersection of architecture and landscape architecture. Super cool. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Susannah Drake. Thank you. Try that. Check.
Yours is too close. I'll just move yours away. Okay. Got it?
Mine's off.
Yours is off?
Try that. Are we good?
I dare go back. Okay. One of the speakers, I don't know, maybe you all are watching this, but one of the speakers said it's important to just show up. And I thought, you know, a lot of, it's a really just important lesson in life. That sounds really echoey, but maybe if I move over here, it'll be less echoey. Or just turn it down a little bit. I don't know. How are the people, how am I sounding in the back?
Good.
Is it okay? It's not that loud. Okay. All right. I can speak up. Anyway, but this person, I don't even remember, it was somebody super famous, and they said, you know, just show up. Just you have to just keep trying and trying. And I am very persistent, and as Taylor suggested, I'm an architect and a landscape architect, and I've just worked quite hard over the years to get all of these professional qualifications that enable me to do this really cool work. But I don't always succeed. And I just say that at the beginning of this lecture. Like, I try, and sometimes I fail. But in failure, I learn things. And then I do better work the next time. So that's just, it's something to take away or with you in life, that, you know, don't let the little failures get in the way of the big picture achievements that you might have in mind. And with that in mind, I'm going to talk about this idea that I have, or this lecture that I call the Geophysical City. And I'm really honored to be a Sappenfield lecturer here. I'm currently a professor at the Cooper Union, but I'm an adjunct because I do a lot of things and I wear a lot of hats. There are iconic projects like my 2010 MoMA Rising Currents project was work that was done in collaboration with the 2020 AIA Firm of the Year Award, ARO, Architecture Research Office. And they've really empowered legions of designers and policymakers to integrate nature-based design into climate change mitigation. So the project elevated the discourse about urban ecosystems and proposed holistic solutions to affect urban policy and inspire action. We also literally proposed elevating the edge of Lower Manhattan, but also most people saw was this kind of green apron around the edge of the island, this kind of protective marshland to protect the city. But it was really a much more holistic idea. So at the neighborhood scale, with the goal of making more resilient environments, we empower communities, and in this case the Gowanus community of Brooklyn, with replicable strategies that could be deployed to reduce the pestilence of combined sewer overflows and control flooding and add needed open space. So the urgency of the community's voice was elevated to bring policy change and curb some of the physical barriers that were lowered to facilitate increased permeability. So there's sort of two really emblematic projects for me that I like to start out with, because this is the Sponge Park, and there'll be a book coming out about this over the summer. And then Rising Currents, which was about protecting, you know, a major metropolis. But in terms of my work, in general, so I like to think of going from innovation to implementation, and when I started my practice, a lot of the work related to the adaptation of infrastructure systems. I was really entranced by post-industrial infrastructure when I was in graduate school, and I saw the potential for sort of an invention of new kinds of systems that manage stormwater or make new public space or reconnect communities to break down some of the boundaries that were created by these infrastructure systems. And then ultimately, you know, the sort of the holy grail of all of this is to implement these projects and make the public space. In this case, this is one down in North Little Rock, Argenta Plaza, where we built a new plaza in a vacant lot, and actually an old parking lot. So what I've found is over my career, and it's been a while. I've been out of graduate school for about 30 years. I've gone through these periods of invention, the yellow bars, and I've applied for grants, and I've done kind of more theoretical work. And then I've had these nodes of implementation where I'm experimenting, I'm trying things, I'm occasionally failing, occasionally succeeding, I'm learning things along the way. And the projects have gotten successively bigger, and you know, there's sort of a next chapter that's happening now in terms of both implementation of some of the things that were started earlier in this timeline, and in terms of sort of the beginnings of a new chapter. This whole idea of the geophysical city is really kind of my next chapter. So you're hearing kind of the let's call it the outline or the rough draft of what is to come. But I've been considering really the relationship between geomorphology, urbanity, infrastructure, and performance and beauty since I founded DLANDstudio in 2005. And so this is kind of a demonstration of that, or a representation of that process. So in the spring of 2022, my New York-based firm joined Sasaki. And I told a bunch of you at lunch sort of a bit more of the backstory. I'll keep it short now. But the partnership brings together two leading interdisciplinary design firms to collectively tackle 21st century design challenges. And together we're from 30 countries, we speak 45 languages, and we have over 50% women. And we place our histories and diverse backgrounds in the foreground, and we allow our varied and collective experiences to shape our approach to work, our process, and our design ethos. So, you know, this is a range of some of the projects that I did before the merger. So before the merger, DLANDstudio had worked to make cities more ecologically productive and developed methods to layer environmental, engineering, and political structures and make real change in the built environment. But I recognized that I needed scale. Like, I needed a larger group of collaborators in order to achieve these massive projects that I envisioned, like, you know, doing this huge project in Lower Manhattan, or, you know, completely redesigning the tidal basins of Washington, D.C. These big visions require bigger teams. And I wanted to be able to lead the projects. We wanted to be the prime actors in these big projects. So anyway, that and the fact that I was going back and forth between Colorado and New York, because my husband's from Colorado. So, you know, personal life sometimes impacts your life decisions. And the Sasaki had just opened an office in Denver, and it was run by one of my former students from Harvard, who was this real superstar. So I started talking to Anna, of course, who's amazing, and I said, Anna, do you think Sasaki would want to have a New York office? And it turns out I was on a list already of firms that they were planning to talk to potentially purchase and have a New York office. So anyway, it all worked out in a really wonderful way. And we dated for a couple of years, and then we ended up merging. Because it's always good to date for a while before jumping into these things. So Sasaki is this great platform. We have planners, we have ecologists, we have architects, we have civil engineers. One thing we have landscape architects. One of the things I'm really excited about is we have this strategies group that develops this really cool specialized software, which is becoming increasingly useful in our practice. And, you know, like tomorrow, I'm flying to Taliesin West because we're doing the master plan for Frank Lloyd Wright's Western Outpost. And I'm bringing my ecologist, and I'm bringing my civil engineer, and I'm bringing my strategies person, and we're all going to be there kind of figuring out the future of that campus, that really important historic campus. So anyway, so you know, there were projects like this that I knew about from Sasaki. This is the before image of the Chicago Riverwalk. It was just this tiny little bulkhead. And I knew that Sasaki had created this incredible public space, this alchemy of landscape architecture. And when I attended the AIA convention, I visited this site and I thought, oh my God, I've made the right decision. This is such a good thing. And some of the things that we're doing are so exciting. You know, just not only having the accessibility of these kayaks and bringing all the people down, but also these floating wetlands are these incredible kind of mechanisms for cleaning the water that's coming out of a combined sewer overflow. So, you know, when I experienced this, I thought, okay, I've made the right decision. This is a great merger. So, but back to the title of my talk. So the Geophysical City, and you may be wondering what I mean by that. The next few slides will break it down. But the Geophysical City recognizes that hydrologic and geologic systems have an imprint on urbanity that will re-emerge with climate change. And we can fight those forces of nature, but at what cost? You know, we've had an attitude of being able to always hold nature at bay. And, you know, it might be a little more practical if we started thinking about paying attention to the natural systems with which we're, or in which we're planning our cities. So I'm just going to go through these really kind of quickly, but this is this interesting, I dug these slides up actually when I was back in graduate school, this cross-section of New York City. And I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that there's some geology jokes about New York being full of schist. But when you used to look at the cross-section or the elevation of the city, you could see that there were tall buildings in some places and shorter buildings in other places. Well, the tall buildings used to exist in the places where you had bedrock, right? And then the shorter buildings were in places where there was basically a swamp or lowlands, right? Now with engineering, we fight against that a little bit more, but it was this really interesting phenomena that I think is important to consider. So in simple terms, I like to think of you know, if we look at the Earth, at the planet and its atmosphere, which created life, and its core, which made the topography. So geomorphology is the shape of the land. So earth science professor J. Taylor Perrin from MIT suggests that in geology there are forces that roughen and forces that smooth. So the roughening forces include movement of the tectonic plates of the lithosphere that kind of float over a circulating mantle, and the interaction of the plates creates earthquakes and volcanic activities. This is science that my dad worked on in the 50s. So he helped to prove plate tectonics. So I grew up with this. So it's like embedded in my mind. But think about that. So my father fought in World War II, and he came back from World War II, and he got his PhD at Columbia, and they were going out and they were mapping the ocean floors. They didn't know. They hadn't proved plate tectonics. It seems so fundamental to our knowledge now that you have these geologic plates that are moving around, but it was only proven relatively recently. And what that means is that you had a huge amount of building that was happening without that knowledge, right? I mean, of course, we can look back to Japan and we say, okay, well, Japanese joinery is really good for building with earthquakes, but there's a lot of ignorance about building for this kind of tectonic activity as well. So, or denial. So anyway, so then the forces that smooth. So rivers and streams are among the forces that erode and smooth the landscape, and the speed of water and the material over which it passes creates different form. And I heard some wonderful discussions today about geologic activity. Clearly you all are aware of that, and it's starting to integrate your work, which is really exciting, because in some places that isn't discussed as much. Then there are patterns that relate to culture. So the patterns we create on the land that support agriculture, habitation, congregation, and social space, security, shelter, and transportation, right? So this is just this little map of a little city in Italy. So patterns can come from economics, pathways between important sites, the need to secure, you can see the little fortress here, and access to water among many drivers. Then patterns can also come from our need to come together, our need for a collective activity as we have today. And then patterns can also come from policies of exclusion and segregation. So there are lots of different patterns in the landscape, some better actors than others. And then ecology is about the relationship of organisms to one another and to their environment. And it's a set of relationships between complex systems and their surroundings. So ecology is not synonymous with environmentalism, which is about advocacy for the protection of natural resources. So I love this image of the East Coast because when you look at this, you see this sort of large green landscape. But if you start to zoom into it, you start to see the cities emerging. But ecology is about the relationship of these organisms, and at some scales, you see different kinds of things. So a landscape left abandoned will go through iterations of succession with patterns of shifting based on various microclimates. And this is actually an image of the Gowanus Canal, where it's this incredibly dirty post-industrial canal, but meanwhile, you have this emergent ecology coming together. So I start to look at the connections between these things, between ecology and culture, current discourse of ecological urbanism and biomimicry, I would say, fall into this category. There's a lot of discussion about the potential for examining this intersection, and I think it's a fruitful discussion. I think this is something that I mentioned earlier in one of the classes, the work of ecological patterns in connection, as a connection between ecology and design. This is the work of Richard T.T. Foreman, and it suggests 3 key steps to bring landscape design to public conscience: science, design, and a bold vision. And what's interesting, I think you all should buy this book or read his writings, because he talks about the connection between the forms of different ecological systems and their ecological productivity, and it's powerful. It's a really powerful thing for us to understand, that say patches of a landscape or of a landscape type aren't as valuable as, say, a connected landscape. And it's a really simple idea, but it's something that really empowers us as designers. And then, that can then start to connect into these huge kind of larger scale thinking or projects dealing with the kind of larger patterns of ecological systems across planets, or across our planet. So this was the MoMA Rising Current project, and it was really looking at the combination of ecology and engineering and urbanity, and trying to realize some of these ideas. And then we have earth and culture. And again, this is Rising Currents, so examining these connections of things. And then looking at historical indigenous patterns to sort of consider how they related to the landscape, and now how we can push some of those ideas forward. So the landscapes record the planet's past and offer clues about its future. So our research in geomorphology, the scientific study of landscapes, deciphers these records to discover how geology, climate, and life intertwine to shape the surface of the Earth and other planets and moons. We use fieldwork, mathematical and computational modeling, remote sensing, spacecraft data, and laboratory experiments. Most of our work falls into 3 areas: landscape evolution, planetary surfaces, and human landscape. This is a quote, this is not my writing, this is a quote from J. Taylor Perrin, who is a scientist at MIT. And what I find fascinating is this could be written by a designer. This is thinking about spatial concepts, and that's why I think it's kind of fundamental. But the reason that this is important is, this is an image of Miami, and the blue, not just the dark blue, but the lighter blue, that's all an area that's going to be flooded in the not too distant future, in say the next 30 or 40 years. And so what we were projecting in that project was where the high ground would be, and how that can actually be used to create a more equitable city in the future. So the research is using planning and design to analyze and interpret the systems embedded in earth science, ecology, and anthropology to explore, or it explores typological and geographical case studies. And I'd say my project is to invent and explore theoretical expressions at the intersection of these things. So what I'll talk about now, and now it kind of it gets away from the abstract into a more real case studies. So this is an important quote. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So this, the reality of transitioning from theoretical ideas to practical application is not always straightforward. And I learned the hard way through our Gowanus Canal Sponge Park project. So after complaining about a particularly challenging meeting at the Department of Environmental Protection, Kevin Clark, who was one of the project engineers at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, said to me, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So this saying is often attributed to Yogi Berra or Albert Einstein, but unfortunately, it came from a much less cool source. Well, sorry, Benjamin Brewster, editor of the Yale Literary Magazine, and sorry to anybody who might have gone to Yale, but I think that's a lot less cool than Yogi Berra. But apparently he said something like this in the 1882 Yale Literary Magazine. And I would say that after 30 years of practice, I concur that it is harder to build these things or to realize these things than to actually plan them. But I would say that the struggle is worth it. So the Gowanus Sponge Park started with this metaphor that wetlands act like sponges. And I was looking at this area in Gowanus that had undergone this incredible transformation over the years from a wetland to, I'm just trying to see how I do this one. Which button do I do? This one? I guess it's, oh well, that's not working. I'll just stay over here. It had undergone this incredible transformation from a wetland to an industrial area to a post-industrial area. And it's this low area within or in Brooklyn that's bordered by Brooklyn Heights, Cobble Hill, and Prospect Park. It's actually this incredibly beautiful, or was this incredibly beautiful post-industrial landscape, but it was really dirty. So I gotta do a little shout out to Spencer Whitmore, who is a Ball State grad, who did these drawings for me because I needed I needed these graphics for my book. Right. So anyway, this is the diagram of a combined sewer overflow. And back when I was doing this work back in 2008, this was a relatively untalked about concept that when you have sanitary sewage and you get to, and rain combining in these combined sewer systems, the overflow goes into our waterways. And so the concept behind the sponge park was that you redirect the water that's falling on the surface of the ground and you channel that into these street end sponge parks. And so he created this graphic too. I like how it looks like SpongeBob. It was particularly cute. But the issue here is that in Gowanus, it's an EPA Superfund site. It's really dirty, and you have all this water that's coming over dirty ground. It's collecting all the oil, it's collecting all the schmutz, all the garbage, and it's bringing it down to the street ends, and the water has nowhere to go. And the other issue is that it's also going into the combined sewer areas, combined sewer outlets in the upland areas. And if you look at the surface of the water there, that's actually poo. On the top of the water in the middle of New York City in the Gowanus. It's disgusting. And it's dangerous. So I have this slide of Richard Nixon and Rachel Carson. So I feel as if Rachel Carson's actions, and there are others that were involved in, obviously, in advocating for the environmental movement, but I think Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, really highlighted the fact that we were destroying our environment and was one of the factors in helping to push forward the environmental movement, which then put pressure on people like Richard Nixon to create the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And the reason that's important for me is that the EPA, he also created the EPA, and the EPA has these consent decrees against cities that have combined sewer overflow systems to clean up their waters, right? So that all is putting pressure on New York City to clean up the Gowanus, and so that enabled my project. So I'm dealing with a global issue, combined sewer overflows. It's not just in the United States, it's all over the world. And thinking about it through a local pilot project. The pilot started with a master plan and then moved into a smaller pilot project. So the idea behind the Gowanus Sponge Park was to make more absorbent landscapes in the area that surrounded the canal. It used to be a swamp, as you saw in one of those early images, but it's all been hardened, it's all paved, and so there's nowhere for the water to go. So what we were trying to do is actually restore that historic hydrology and also make a public space, and also use plants that could start to phytoremediate some of the toxins in the soil and in the dirty water. So we want to use the landscape, the power of these landscape systems to actually clean up the canal. And while we're doing that, also make a new cultural redevelopment area, because there are a lot of really cool old buildings in the Gowanus that could be repurposed. And that was what we planned back in 2008. That building, that really cool building off in the distance beyond the water tower, has been turned into an art center now. So a lot of the things that happened within this master plan have come to fruition. So we worked with a really wonderful team to do this project, a team of engineers and soil scientists and people who were from Manhattan College who were doing monitoring. And you'll notice that there's these yellow lines around the streets. Our idea was that the green infrastructure systems would thread back into the city and create this kind of urban stitch to bring people to the waterfront. And part of that related to the fact that there were all these industrial buildings that went all the way up to the water's edge. So instead of, and you're not actually allowed to go out over the water, I'll tell you about that in a minute, but instead of creating a continuous esplanade around the canal, which would only give value to the waterfront properties, we thought let's create value in the whole neighborhood and also align those pathways with some of the old wetland zones, and then also use those pathways to connect to existing open spaces. So we're looking for all of these synergies to bring the landscape together. So this is one of the most important drawings that I have ever created, and the reason it's important is that it outlines the jurisdictions that exist in the Gowanus, and it explains who owns what and who controls what part of that landscape. So, for instance, the soil underneath the canal is controlled by the EPA Superfund people. That's one entity. It's a navigable waterway, so it's controlled by the water is controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. There was some question about the bulkheads being historic element, which would have brought in the state preservation group called it's like a SHPO. Organization. The first 5 feet of soil in the upland area is controlled by the State Department of Environmental Conservation because it's a brownfield. All the water that flows over the ground is controlled by the Department of Environmental Protection, which is a city agency. All the green space is controlled by the New York City Parks Department, which is a city agency. It's a street, so that's controlled by the Department of Transportation. You have to have the fire department access and the garbage access. The first 50 feet of space is controlled by very special regulations set up by the Department of City Planning, and it includes things like how much shade you need and social seating. the little balcony over the water is actually illegal because you can't do that because of a Department of Environmental Conservation rule that says that you can't have shade over the water because apparently it is detrimental to fish habitat, as if anything can live in here. Anyway, so there are about 200 permits you have to get for any waterfront project, and that's not even in an EPA Superfund area. So it was really complicated, and it's like the pilot is like this big. It's like this tiny little project, but it was important because it was trying to move the needle on adding these permeable spaces, on these green engineered spaces in New York City. So anyway, so this is just an image of the catchment area showing that we had a projected area. You all you landscape architects know that you can calculate the amount of water in that catchment area and then design your green infrastructure system to manage that water. So, and we chose the street that we chose because it had the largest catchment area. So anyway, so this is a little animation that shows how it works. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, there we go. So this is the existing condition. So we took these out because they had curbs around them, so they'd only catch the rain that fell from the sky. And then we put in these new bioswales. There actually is a notch in that one, so it'll let the water in. And then I designed it using a series of what I called these bioretention cells. I used precast concrete because in New York City we have a low bid contracting rule in the Parks Department, actually in a lot of city agencies. And so I needed to control construction quality. And so I thought if I have precast, I can control it. And I'd been screwed on another project where I didn't, so I knew to actually insist on that. So there's a whole pre-treatment zone. You can see the water is coming down the street, and then it goes into this pre-treatment zone where it all collects, and that gets all the little fine silt out and has a screen over it so it collects all the other big garbage. And then it goes into the cells, and then the plants will use it, the soils will absorb it, the microorganisms will be happy in the soil. And then if there's a lot of rain, more than the 1.2-inch storm we designed for, then the excess will go into a sand filter and then go into an existing drain and into the canal. And the idea is that this will become this new open space for the Gowanus, and that it'll provide more public access, and that we'll get birds and butterflies. And what has been exciting is that we have had, it's been in for 4 years, and actually more than that. It's been in for 7 years. And it's the place in Gowanus where we have the only native bees. So it's kind of cool. So this is just it in construction. It's kind of unheard of to do this kind of thing with precast concrete. But anyway, we did it, and this was it when it was built. And then I've since done some other projects in Gowanus. And one is this giant tank facility that's actually managing a lot of the combined sewer waters before they go into the canal. So the city determined that they couldn't absorb all the extra runoff with green infrastructure, so they were forced to build this big tank facility. And so we worked with the city to create this new open space framework on top of one of the tanks in Gowanus. So it's this new public park that sort of connects in different ways. We have these 3 zones, one called the wedge, one called the shelf, and one called the seam. And each addresses kind of a different set of relationships. The wedge connecting to the canal, the shelf is kind of a larger, more open public space, and the seam connecting back to the city. We used a lot of industrial materials that existed on the site and then reinterpreted them in how they were expressed. We had to use a lot of material or a lot of standard elements from the Parks Department, and also use plants that really required low to zero maintenance. We also had to consider the mobility of a bunch of trucks that were going to be running through this space, so we couldn't just make it a big green space. We had to think about how the trucks could access a series of pump-out stations. So this is it. And the building behind it, the screening was designed by Annabelle Seldorf's office, and they were really wonderful to work with, really talented architects. And this is just the seam showing the connection to back to the city, and then this open space up on the top, and then the wedge connecting to the canal. So anyway, so we've been working in Gowanus in different ways over the years, and then there in 2021 there was this rezoning, and basically the whole place just got torn down. Like all the industrial buildings got torn down, and there are these giant buildings going in, and they're planning 8,500 new housing units, which I just think is not the wisest thing to be doing. I could say it in a less delicate way, but because this is the floodplain, this is what we anticipate, and there's a suggestion that the ground is going to be elevated, and some of the buildings are elevated, but those big towers that you saw just a minute ago, they're not elevated. And so they're just saying, oh yeah, we're going to have flood barrier doors that are going to close if there's a flood. But this is not, this image, that's not Photoshop. That was a few weeks ago. So that's Gowanus, and it's already getting so much flooding, and this is the projection of what they're going to be building in this area that's already flooding. And so I just think it's kind of crazy. So that'll be a chapter in the book, and I'll probably never work in New York again after that comes out. But we'll see. Because there are options. And the Rising Currents project, I worked a lot with adaptation in place, but in 2016, actually it was probably 2015, I won a competition in collaboration with Rafi Siegel, who's a professor at MIT, to do a project that we sort of loosely titled Coastal Urbanism, but it was looking at the New York City waterfront and proposing a plan for how to adapt the whole waterfront. So the Regional Plan Association has done a series of plans of New York. It was a group of business people who came together and said, hey, we've got all these agencies, and we've got New York, and we've got New Jersey, and we've got New Jersey, we've got Connecticut, we've got this metropolitan area that doesn't have a common planning metric or organization. So the RPA became an organization that would bring together the different regional actors for a collective vision. So some of the original ideas had to do with this kind of spoke and radial system, but what was interesting about the fourth regional plan was that it looked at corridors. So it's much more of an ecological approach. So instead of saying, okay, here's Manhattan, here's the money, and then here's the way everybody gets there, this one had to do with this kind of region of the highlands, and then, actually, let me look at the next slide. There was the highlands, there was the suburban belt that they called the inner ring. There was this thing called the Triborough, which was actually a transportation area, and then there was the Bight, and I was looking at the Bight. And the Bight is a term for a sailor's knot, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. But the idea was that there was a much greater recognition of ecologies and watersheds within this plan. So Rafi and I came up with this sort of overall mantra of moving from a water line, to a zone. So thinking about how there's almost like a crumple zone that needs to happen along the water's edge, and it's actually a feature that used to exist in our landscapes. When you look at the barrier islands all along Long Island and New Jersey, those barrier islands used to shift and move, and they were not static, but we've hardened them. And because we've hardened them and because we have buildings on them, we now have more damage that's happening to those hardened landscapes, and those landscapes can no longer provide the protective function that they used to for the upland areas. So anyway, so within this, we were looking at energy, recreation, conservation, and habitat, or habitation, and then we came up with some concepts for how we would sort of organize a new city around those ideas. So we had areas that were wet, so those were areas that would always flood. You can see there aren't a lot of people in these zones. They were places that were much more about an ecological approach. Then we had these semi-wet areas, and those were areas that might have more landscape programs that involved people, but probably not a lot of buildings. And then we'd had the upper area, so the dry, high ground areas. And what we were projecting was that those high ground areas would be the future waterfront. So we're looking at where the waterfront is going to be in 100 years. We also did a GIS analysis and discovered that there were these unrealized transportation right-of-ways, and those red lines showed train corridors that stretch out on Long Island that are actually on high ground. So we thought, oh, well, there's an opportunity for transit-oriented development. So let's just move people, which is not so easy to do, because that the blue zone represents about 265,000 people. I think Dayton is 150,000 people. I'm not sure how I didn't look up Indianapolis, but 250,000 people, that's a lot of people, right? But our proposal is to have that whole population migrate back to that higher ground and make a linear city along that transportation corridor. So the days of Manhattan being, the be-all and end-all of New York City are kind of over. There's I mean, it's still awesome, but there are many more kind of tentacles coming out from Manhattan of urban density. There's a lot in Brooklyn. There's a lot in Queens. So our thought was this could be this new kind of extended area of density leading out into the basically toward Kennedy Airport. And one of the concepts here, and I do a lot of work with these kind of cute diagrams, was that maybe you can take some of that upzoning area and use that as a fund to buy people out of the coastal areas, and hopefully use it to maintain the coastal areas, because one of the big hurdles in green infrastructure is maintenance. And we learned that again firsthand on the Gowanus Sponge Park. So anyway, so we're we had those last slides I showed were all about development, and this one's about creating a new transportation and park network that we could have boats and parks and that all integrated into this new city to have this new water life. And then I'm going to show one more project, which is kind of fun. This one is, it's a project titled History Secured. It looks forward and back. It recognizes the power of nature and the patterns that predated Western settlement of the area. This is Washington, D.C., in case you don't know. And it draws upon the legacies of L'Enfant, the Hudson River School of Beaux-Arts, and the WPA. An approach that reconsiders the limitations of modernism. Our design embraces environmental and human complexity and utilizes old and new technology to create a more secure future. So I was looking at these maps and thinking about how this landscape used to move, and the people and how they inhabited the landscape was a lot more fluid. We didn't harden the edges. We migrated with the seasons. And then when you look at the 1700s representation of the landscape, this is Washington, D.C., this is L'Enfant's plan. L'Enfant's plan's in the pencil, and then the engraved version is next to it. And I have these juxtaposed because L'Enfant showed these edges that were a little bit softer. I think he was still thinking in terms of, I mean, even though he's like Mr. Axis, I think he was still thinking in terms of these kind of slightly softer water edges, whereas when the engraver got a hold of it, he created these fortified edges. And these two images here, I think, show that particularly well with these and part of that happened because L'Enfant, I don't know, he was kind of dragging his feet and he wasn't getting the plan done. And so ultimately the powers that be got frustrated, and so they ended up sending his drawing to a printer in Philadelphia, and then they created the plan. So there's a lot of stuff that got drawn in the official plan that really wasn't part of his vision. So part of what we were trying to reflect in the design was also this power and the symbolism of nature reflected in the Hudson River School paintings, and then also the kind of revitalization of classical monuments and infrastructure in the 1900s that came out of the World Columbia Exposition and also came out of an AIA convention. Put my AIA hat on, that happened in Washington. So a lot of these monuments happened because of this kind of renewed idea about classicism, and I'm obviously giving this a very short description, but and then there's also concepts of the WPA that we built into this idea or into our planning, and then also importantly looking at modernism and how from 1900 to 2004 12% of the Potomac watershed got paved. So in Washington, D.C., we have this little issue. The reason we were brought in to work on this project, this was a laboratory. It was like they brought in 5 design teams to work on this. And they brought us in because the tidal basin area is flooding, and those beautiful cherry trees that exist around or near the mall are dying because they're flooding. So, but if you pave your watershed, of course this is going to happen, right? Especially when you're building in a floodplain and in a former swamp. So this projection, this is the 2019 projected flood zone. That's just 2019. That's not even the future. So we really can't ignore this problem. So we kind of said, okay, you know, if that area is going to flood, let's let it flood, and let's create new kinds of barriers or areas to absorb the water, and then also to reconnect the mall to this area. We used a lot of the pilots and prototypes that we developed on other projects and thought about how those could be deployed in different ways throughout the area. We moved the Martin Luther King Memorial to this former public space outbound of the Lincoln Memorial onto this little jetty. The jetty would create a flow and a sedimentation that would help to create the wetland. We created a connection, a land bridge from the Washington Monument out to the Jefferson Monument. So we're like connecting a lot of things, even though it seems like we're dividing a lot of things. You know, creating a new public space on the road side of the Jefferson Memorial as a new kind of public landscape that's also a protective barrier so that someone can't drive off the highway and into one of the memorials. So, and then looking at sort of a new area to plant the cherries, and then also a renewal of these swimmable waters. So relocating the FDR Memorial over to closer to the mall, closer to the World War II Memorial, and ultimately burying a lot of the traffic in order to facilitate safer pedestrian connection all across that landscape. So it's really, it's creating this very different view of Washington, D.C., but something that is potentially a lot more sustainable, a lot safer, and protective of a lot of the resources that exist upland, because we do have these elevated areas that will protect the Smithsonian and the African American Museum and the FBI. So it's a big, bold vision, and we'll see where that goes. So I do want to do one more, if we can. You guys mind? It's just okay. because this is cool. So, because this one, it ties it back to the infrastructure. So, so cities, and I've done a lot of work with cities and highway infrastructure, and the term infrastructure, like, who knew? It developed in the World War II era in reference to military logistical operations. And General Dwight D. Eisenhower, all about national defense, you know, the highway system is purported to be about national defense, but it was obviously also about real estate development and creating markets. And there are also many layers of kind of racial overlays that can tie into that I don't have time to go into today. But you know, beyond the building of these highways, I'm grateful for Lady Bird Johnson, who helped to advocate for the Highway Beautification Act, which was put in place the year I was born, because it did help to improve the design of some of these highway systems. But unfortunately, you know, they're designed for engineering, for moving cars, and not designed for moving through cities. And we feel those impacts regularly. They've also been used as tools of racial segregation. So I have a project, an animation that I'm going to show next that is not in the US, but it's kind of close enough. It started in Montreal, but it was a competition again, and let's see if we can make it go. Here we go. This one has sound. So we were asked to create a better connection from the airport to downtown Montreal, and we decided to look at all of North America. Because, you know, why not? For that title. She's a professor at The Ohio State, and this was her baby when she was working for me. Within each of these methodologies, we had a corresponding set of axonometric drawings that showed what it would be like to be in the spaces. So this was just a big idea about how to reconnect cities with infrastructure, how to adapt those infrastructure systems. And it really grew out of work that I did when I first started my practice, on a project I called Reconnecting Strategies for the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, which examined the site where Robert Moses had basically plowed a highway through a neighborhood. And this is around the corner from my office. And I felt that this was something that could be fixed. It was around the time when Brooklyn Bridge Park was being built, and this neighborhood was getting nothing, and Brooklyn Heights was getting a beautiful park, and I thought, well, that's not fair. And so I thought, I can do something about this. I can come up with this vision, at least, for a better future. So I applied for a grant. I've done a lot of work with grants. So students, it's important to know how to write. So don't ignore your writing. Because you can get money if you write a good grant. Like, people will give you money to just do your own projects. It's pretty cool. So this landscape by Moses, you know, he promoted the idea that he was creating these parkways, and he did create a lot of playgrounds around the city, but also created these really awful highways that ran through the city. And you can see here what I was talking about, how they plowed through that brownstone neighborhood and sort of interrupted the donut of the buildings with this plan of a parkway that you can see is not really a beautiful parkway. And these highways bring with them a lot of problems with public health, disconnecting people, bringing particulate matter into neighborhoods, and creating territories for gang violence and exacerbating poverty. So we did some analysis. We always do a lot of research when we do our projects, and we found that this particular section, so I was showing you one section that I looked at, and then I did a more real project here, was built in 1950. So we recognized that was pretty obsolescent infrastructure. It needed repair. We also worked very closely with the community who was fighting for environmental justice, fighting to get this a park instead of this highway. So we collaborated with them on this vision to create this new park space over the highway, between these existing bridges, and have had a series of rallies. We've been advocating for this for years to try to break down these barriers. And you know, these barriers exist in many parts of the city, and as I suggested, it's aging infrastructure. And it's what that means is that it creates an opportunity for replacement of the infrastructure, and if you're going to replace it, you can replace it as it is, or you can look at opportunities for how you might actually bridge in between and fill in between those spaces to create this new park. So if you're going to spend the $30 million or 40, whatever it costs to redo those bridges, why not extend them and make something better? So this project was really kind of fun. So many creative people have got involved. They even made a cartoon character related to it, called La Reina Verde, and it's after Diana Reina, who was the city council person who was really the main advocate for the project. But I'm sort of talking about a bunch of different projects here. There was the work that I did with the NISCA grant in one part of Brooklyn. There was this project in another part of the BQE. And then that also led to doing work with the DOT and the Design Trust for Public Space, developing strategies for what to do under elevated structures throughout the city. So about 700 miles of elevated structures run through New York City, and this is just one example of, you know, hey, let's take the space underneath the elevated highways, channel the water into these bioswales, or let's take a space that has this giant canopy and use it as this new public space with a kind of with an art program, and you know, try to turn it into something that's not a really sort of scary, you know, dark piece of infrastructure, but turn it into something that's an engaging new public space for the city. So just to conclude, so the projects I would say that I've shared with you today reveal use of natural systems to benefit urban life, but they also they're kind of about this overlap. They're the overlap of the cultural, the ecological, the geophysical. They're all kind of coming together in what I describe as the geophysical city. So thank you.